So we have leaking underground storage tank. We have petrol from that tank leaking into the ground, and we have a significant plume that's been established in the groundwater. We have a source that's pretty well defined. Pretty much if we have a petrol station, either current or former, it will have a leaking tank, and there will be contamination associated with that site. So we have vapor, liquid, vapor and liquid pathways associated with it. There's potential for exposure at the surface and migration underground, and we have a number of people who are affected by that. So if we want to come in and redevelop that site from a remediation perspective, so let me see if I can't get our list of potential technologies on the other screen, so we can do this simultaneously. So we have first commercial reuse. So the former petrol station is going to be redeveloped into, say, a small shopping center instead. Needs to go through planning because there's there's earthworks happening on site, even though the land use isn't changing. What are the exposure pathways we need to be concerned about for that redevelopment? So for commercial reuse.
Vapor.
Okay, so who might be affected by your vapor?
Customers and workers.
Okay. Yeah, so we have whoever might be coming to the new shopping center. So workers who work there or visitors who are shopping there may come into contact with contaminated vapors. What other exposure pathways do we need to be concerned about? Is it just the inhalation that we need to worry about? Pardon? Okay, so you have groundwater. And who might be exposed to that?
There is a point to the.
Okay. Yeah, so if somebody's extracting the groundwater, which we haven't said anything about, so we'll put a nice disclaimer on that. It depends who's using it, but yeah, it's certainly a possibility that someone is. So that's an exposure pathway we need to be concerned about. What else? Sorry.
Skin contact with it.
Yeah. Yeah, so skin contact, and if skin contact is an issue, then what else is an issue?
Inhalation.
Yes.
We've already covered inhalation, ingestion. So stuff on your hands, not washing your hands, eating your lunch. That's certainly a possibility. So again, we've got workers and visitors. Is there a clever way that we can sever these linkages with the redevelopment of the petrol station without actually doing remediation? Yeah, so what would we do?
Cap.
Yeah, so cap of some kind. And a clever way of doing that, if it's going to be a shopping center, is what? Yeah, car park, tarmac. So in terms of severing the linkages, car park might do that very effectively. And if you don't have contamination rolling off your site, if that groundwater isn't an issue, then that's enough. But if the groundwater is an issue, if it is rolling off the site, if it is mobilizing, then you would need to do something else in addition to the car park to do that. But your remediation may only need to then target the groundwater side of things rather than the whole of the site. What happens if we change to, instead of commercial reuse, we're now talking about residential reuse? Do the exposure pathways change? Or are they the same? Anything new in terms of exposure pathways? That's not the question I asked, though. I didn't ask you about receptors, I asked you about pathways. Yeah, you get the same pathways: inhalation, ingestion, skin contact, but your receptors are different. So who else are receptors this time? Yeah. Yeah, so instead of workers, we have residents. And we have children. You can't attach conditions to residential sites saying it's safe for residential use, but no children. We have housing associations that do that, but that's a different thing. That's more for social conditions than it's not land use. We don't. We also have visitors, different contexts. In terms of the conceptual site model, one of the things that came up in the quiz is the discussion about concentrations of contaminant. A conceptual site model will never capture concentrations. It's about identifying the pollutant linkages. So it doesn't get into detail about concentration. So high concentration, low concentration, if the linkage is there, it's there. And that's all a conceptual site model will represent. But what you need to do in order to sever those linkages is now a bit more aggressive because of the vulnerability of the receptors. Your remediation targets are going to be a lot lower because your threshold values are a lot lower. So the last thing to think about, I'm going to ask the same question again for the residential site. So the residential reuse, but let's start first with commercial. So we have our list of potential technologies for commercial use. We've established that we're going to use a car park to prevent further mobility of water into the contaminant to spread it. So we've developed our car park to protect our human receptors at the surface, but we still have mobility through the groundwater, discharge to surface waters, potential contamination of adjacent areas. But what can we do for remediation to address that contamination? So let's run through the list. So two colors, so I have purple and I have red. So red will be residential. So let's just run through them. Can groundwater pump and treat work here?
Yes.
Anybody say no? Okay, good. So groundwater pump and treat is an option. How about air sparging, bioventing, where you're pumping air in to try to liberate your contaminant from the groundwater? Can that be applied here? Would you be okay with it as your remediation, considering you've got the car park on the surface and then you're bubbling in the groundwater to deal with the contamination. So you're saying no, why not? Yeah, so it has problems. So air sparging, it might do something useful, but it's probably not going to be powerful enough, and it might just move the stuff around. So I'd rule it out even for commercial. Soil vapor extraction, is that going to be good enough for groundwater?
Well, it will take a lot of time.
Yeah, essentially you're waiting for everything to evaporate into vadosone so you can pump it out. So it's probably not going to touch your groundwater. So it's probably not going to work for that. Multi-phase extraction. Is that going to work for commercial reuse? Yeah, I see a couple people shaking heads. Yes, definitely. Surfactant enhanced recovery. Is that going to work? It could do. You could screw it up, especially if you don't understand your hydrogeology, but it could plausibly do something. So initial screening says, yeah, it's still okay. Chemox. Yeah. If you find free-phase stuff, you're always best to start with multi-phase, get it out, unless you're burning it. But you wouldn't burn petrol. We don't, smoldering doesn't work particularly well for petrol. For ahead of chemox, ahead of your surfactant treatment, if you found NAPA, pump it out. Deal with that first. Thermal, could that work? Yeah, that's okay. And the heating type would depend on what you're trying to achieve. And I've already given the plot away for smoldering. That's out. Okay, so moving into either. We've done our isolation already, because we've got our car park. But it's not enough on its own. Reactive barrier, would that work? Good. Yeah, PRB's in. Bioremediation for commercial reuse. Yeah, maybe. If it hasn't left the site boundary, then it should be fine. How about biopiling? Why not?
You would have to excavate
So what?
price.
So what? I didn't ask you that. I didn't ask you if it was the best choice. I asked you if it worked. Would it work? Yeah, it would work. It may not be the best idea. But that wasn't a question. How about M&A?
Yes.
Okay, why?
Good car park. It's obviously really good that good car park is easy to forget with it. Just kind of leave it. And as long as the groundwater isn't
Yeah.
flowing, it's contained.
It's plausible, sure. If it's not leaving a site boundary, if you're having degradation, if your car park is stopping further infiltration, if the groundwater is not moving that quickly, that it's being pushed quite far distances, then M&A is plausible, as long as you're not crossing the site boundary. Soil washing. Yeah, probably. Depends on your soil conditions. And how about phyto? Okay, I saw a couple people saying no.
Although it's very slow, but it's good work.
Yeah, if bio is plausible, phyto is plausible, but the same conditions apply to it. As long as it's not crossing a site boundary, as long as it's not killing your plants, as long as something might grow, then it's plausible. Now, the harder question. We change the land use to residential. Which of these things will still work, and in what conditions? What's required in order to achieve residential quality standards to a point you can guarantee you'll get there? Which of these technologies might still work? Yeah. Okay. Thermal remediation. So which one do you like best? Just pick one. Okay. Let's go with conductive heating, in situ thermal desorption. So we're going to cook it until it's out. So we're doing this, presume in situ thermal.
Yeah.
Can you guarantee residential quality of soil at the end of thermal? Anyone, can you guarantee it? If you can't guarantee it, you can't do it. Residential quality soil, your concentrations have to be low enough to support the risk-derived health criteria values associated with that soil quality. Thermal is not going to get you there applied as in situ thermal conductive heating. So I want you to think about this. This is setting up, so next week we have the second quiz. That one's going to close a day earlier than the last one. The reason for that is I want the Friday to go through a couple of points from that while we're still together, rather than trying to do it by email. It's not going to be overly long. It's going to be quite short, as was the first one. But think about this question. Now that I've shifted you from commercial to residential land use, so now we have the potential for different pollutant linkages, and we have more exposure routes. So we have vapor, skin contact, ingestion, but we also have the possibility of growing veg and eating that veg. So we've got lots more potential for exposure to more vulnerable receptors. When we apply these technologies, which ones can still work, and how do we do it in order to achieve that outcome that's safe for residential reuse? I promise you there is an answer, at least one, possibly several, and that's going to be one of the types of questions you encounter on the quiz. So really think about it. If you have questions, get in touch, but that's where we're going to end for today. Thanks very much. And finally, just to reiterate, we have 6 different mechanisms by which remediation could be compelled. 5 of the 6 are regulatory, Part 2A of the Environmental Protection Act, or planning being the most common, permitting, voluntary remediation, anti-pollution works regulations all being possible, but perhaps a little bit less common. And then finally, remediation and compensation via litigation is the last possible mechanism. So when I'm asking questions about regulatory mechanisms, I'm looking for something, one of these 6 things from the list. And then typically who is the regulator. You're either going to be answering whether it's a local authority, which is true for most cases, or special sites where it's the national body. So these are the kinds of questions you might encounter, and these are the answers that I'm looking for. That concludes Lecture 8 on legislation and policy, and we will pick up next time with monitoring, verification, and validation.